Project Van Buren is a bit of unfinished business for the Fallout series, a turning point between two eras, and a final project of one of the most influential developers of the 1990s. It's also one of the highest profile canceled games ever, with nearly 20 years worth of leaked and resurfacing design documents, entire forums dedicated to studying them, and a large number of passionate fans dedicated to recreating it. To some, it's a reminder of how far Fallout has strayed from its CRPG roots. To others, it's a symbol of what could have been. Regardless of your own personal feelings on the project, talking about Fallout Van Buren is as fascinating as it is challenging. But its legacy on the industry is hard to deny, and the volume of information available gives us unique insight into how game development and the market were rapidly changing in the early 2000s, and just maybe where it's headed. This is Van Buren, the original Fallout 3. Before its rise to mainstream success under Bethesda, the Fallout series started in early 1994 at Interplay Software. With basically no staff or deadline, and as lead designer Tim Cain put it, boxes of pizza and a small bag of money, the first Fallout title was largely developed in conference rooms during off hours, as the majority of Interplay was occupied with the recently acquired Dungeons & Dragons license. This gave Cain and co-producer Leonard Boyarsky free rein to develop their idea, turning the Wasteland-inspired game into a retro future apocalypse unlike anything Interplay was working on at the time. And as a result of its success and of the D&D license, Interplay would create Black Isle Studios, an internal developer built from the Fallout team and headed up by producer Feargus Urquhart. While Cain and Boyarsky would leave the studio to form Troika Games less than a year after the release of Fallout 1, Black Isle would still become one of the best RPG developers in the industry. Year after year, they would create isometric powerhouses such as Planescape Torment, and of course Fallout 2. Despite that success, however, when it came to start production on a Fallout 3, Interplay, the Fallout franchise itself, and the industry as a whole would find themselves in three very different places. Interplay, recently going through a buyout from Titus Interactive, would find themselves moving away from the PC, following the trend of focusing on simplified console experiences on the recently released PlayStation 2. Black Isle, on the other hand, after cutting back on retrofuturism and Fallout tactics, instead wanted to return the franchise back to its roots, and create a version of Fallout 3 many of the developers working at the studio had dreamed of. This wasn't their first attempt either. A few years prior, in 1999, Black Isle had a false start with the third Fallout title after struggling with the jump from 2D to 3D when using tech from NDL, resulting in Urquhart shifting the team's focus to the dungeon crawler-inspired Icewind Dale instead. This new attempt, however, started in a very similar way Fallout had under Cain and Boyarsky, with late-night sessions and back conference rooms. This time, however, it was a tabletop campaign, GM'd by Chris Avellone. Avellone had been a designer on Fallout 2, and when he was assigned the project codename Van Buren, he also found himself with no staff or deadline. What he did have, however, was the luxury of time. And with two teams of 6 potential developers in separate campaigns, over the course of 2 years he developed the world with weekly pen and paper sessions of what would become Fallout Van Buren, acid testing the high-level gameplay ideas of what a third Fallout could be, and creating design documents early on for locations and factions, while also creating NPCs and companions out of his co-workers' player characters. The main goal was to develop a game that was much more accommodating to different types of builds, forcing Avellone and his team to create a world for any type of player. While still avoiding assigning archetypes such as rogue or healer as with the first 2 games, players would oftentimes use the tools at hand to build their own. There was a challenge in making, for example, Josh Sawyer's doctor character Arcade Gannon a rewarding build to play and, no pun intended, survive in the world. During this process, Avellone could tell if players weren't having fun and do what he called immediate postmortems to see why. Black Isle and Interplay as a whole was a team of RPG lovers. Their slogan was "By Gamers for Gamers," and this team was their target audience. And this audience was wanting to go beyond just having a small handful of character types as viable builds. It makes for a more interesting game, but also one that's immensely more complicated. At this same time, Avellone was working on another project, a self-proclaimed Fallout Bible, posted on Black Isle forums, and compiled in 2002 to sort out information from the first two games that may have been cut or hidden away as backstory to create a more comprehensive canon, ironing out exactly how civilization crumbled, what a variety of the original 112 Vault experiments were, and more clearly blaming the irradiated creatures on the FEV. It's an interesting read that feels somewhere between a fanzine and a wiki. During the Bible's writing, Avellone was adamant that the project was unrelated to any work on a Fallout 3, stating that a version of the game wasn't currently in any form of production. However, due to mentions of an office-ran Fallout campaign that was the impetus for the projects, dates on location design documents found later, and tweets in 2016 from Avellone, it was confirmed that the project was designed to consolidate lore to prepare for Van Buren. Documents from both of these projects would be handed directly to the design and art teams starting in late 2001, as development would begin to ramp up the following year. As a result, the team would have a more complete picture of what Van Buren could be. It's important to point out that despite the name, none of this was gospel, and worked much more as a writing and design exercise than things written in stone. In the opening of the Bible project, Avellone states his intention isn't to write Black Isle into a corner, and instead to give them potential tools for the future. In later released design documents, it becomes clear that the tabletop game was much more of a basic codex used as a starting point that was rewritten for concept artists and designers to build on. They would become the frankly rather dry design documentation that is expected from the non-consumer facing side of development rather than something a DM would use in a tabletop campaign. As a result of both of these, however, the amount of documentation and lore available about Van Buren is unprecedented compared to other unfinished projects. Even when the project was no longer in production, designers and producers from Black Isle would continue to be asked about it in interviews and on forum threads for almost 20 years, oftentimes speaking very candidly about its tiniest features in a way that can only really exist from a company that felt transparent in a distinctly late 90s sort of way. A tech demo released in 2007 to forum site No Mutants Allowed further adds to the picture, showing in a rudimentary form how Van Buren would play. The demo in particular features a functional version of Van Buren in Baldur's Gate 3's Jefferson engine, and a more complete look at how character building, combat, and inventory systems had changed, despite many of these systems being non-functional. It's only 2 maps from the game's tutorial level, focusing on getting your player to a vault shortly after the bombs fell, and is full of the placeholders and missing pieces that would be expected from something that was unfinished. But it helps place many of Van Buren's pieces. What we have then is a look at Fallout Van Buren that feels equal parts interconnected spiderweb and magic eye poster, one that shifts dramatically based on the choices a player would make. To speak plainly, Van Buren is an overwhelming project to examine, and I want to make it clear that while I've tried to provide as accurate of a look as I can, it may not be 100% identical to what the game itself was. However, in the description as always, I provided a complete list of sources that I used in my research, including not only PDFs of the Fallout Bible and the design documents, but also a link to the tech demo. In the aftermath of Fallout 1 and 2, the New California Republic continues its push into eastern Nevada in the Four Corners region. In Fort Tibbetts, Colorado, awakes a prisoner, your player character, a human supermutant or ghoul who fell asleep in a very different, more primitive prison for a crime they either did or didn't commit. It's controlled by a mysterious advanced AI named Ulysses, and the NCR is here to help you escape. Throughout the region lie the remnants of a pre-war railway that once connected even the most remote of civilizations. Its broken pieces could unite the region, for example, potentially allowing the Blackfoot tribe who desperately turned to slave trading for the mysterious Caesar's Legion into providers of water to surrounding cities. At the Hoover Dam, an NCR-controlled community desperate for aid, you can resolve the conflict between the NCR and Brotherhood of Steel by destroying the secret Brotherhood base or uncovering collusion between them and the Crimson Caravan, the latter of which is using the Brotherhood to gain complete control of the dam and profit from both sides of their war. In New Canaan, a Mormon community on the Salt Lake, a no-win situation has arisen. Their water processing facility is failing, but the people feel opening their walls to outsiders sacrifices the beliefs and goals of their pre-war forebears. Repairing their facility will make them remain isolationist, but persuading them to oust their leader will make them a valued member of the region. In the remains of Boulder, Colorado, a city stricken with a deadly pre-war plague, you encounter Dr. Presper, a cryogenically frozen pre-war scientist and his companions, who imprisoned you in Fort Tibbetts. You discover Presper was also responsible for your escape, infecting the region with the plague, using you and the other prisoners as vectors. When Ulysses realizes that the disease has spread too far, it will provide launch codes to a pre-war ballistic space station that would eradicate the infected area as a means of containment. Presper, however, planned to change the targeting coordinates, instead wiping out the entirety of civilization once again, as he and a select handful of people survive inside the Boulder Dome, a pre-war city-like research facility designed to survive a nuclear blast, and awaiting a blank slate to rebuild civilization. Using a largely preserved pre-war launch site, you pursue Presper into space to discover he and his party have already launched the missiles. When you encounter Presper face-to-face, you can overload the reactor and destroy the space station, face him and his companions in combat, or inform them of Presper's real motivations. With him out of the way, the missiles are still falling, and even with a high science skill, 2 of them will remain. Where they fall, whether that's Hoover Dam, New Canaan, or a variety of locations from previous games, is up to you. The escape pods are your only option for leaving the station, and without proper landing coordinates, you find yourself back on Earth but in an unfamiliar location, forced to wander alone into the sunset. As a result of its story, Van Buren has a clear central thesis, asking the question, how does one fix the world? In the wake of disaster, each faction and character has its own way of reclaiming what was lost. Presper wants to start anew, the NCR wants to continue where America left off, and the Brotherhood, as always, wants to protect humanity by not letting its deadliest weapons fall into inferior hands. And in the middle of it all is you, the prisoner, rebuilding the broken infrastructure of the pre-war, uniting or destroying factions, and through your kindness or cynicism, showing Presper whether or not the tough remnants of humanity are actually worth saving. It's a hopeful message, despite its surprisingly down ending, one that feels distinctly Fallout, and it's interesting to see how this idea seeps into even the most mundane of side quests and even its final moments. How do you, the player, make this world better in your eyes? Where do you drop the bombs? And how does that change the way the world regrows? It's also interesting, taking a look into these docs, how the tabletop game influenced the gameplay. When Van Buren was being played in those back rooms, gradually over time Avellone revealed that the 2 separate parties were influencing each other's game. This version of Fallout 3 was going to be no different, with you and your companions being directly influenced by Presper and his. It makes for an antagonistic force that feels like it's being manipulated at the hands of Presper rather than being malicious. From a gameplay perspective, however, Van Buren was going to be different than its predecessors. While the Fallout series was one of the last bastions of a pure turn-based combat system, Van Buren was going to be the first mainline title to incorporate real-time with pause. Some of this was partially a result of using Baldur's Gate 3's Jefferson engine, but real-time combat was also ordered directly from Interplay higher-ups, focused directly on capturing the trends of the time rather than being an intentional choice by developers. To accommodate VATs from previous games, the team prevented characters in motion from regenerating AP, balancing out the combat to prevent them from endlessly running away from opponents. It was a compromise, and still allowed players to choose a pure turn-based experience if they wanted, but it was a sign of what was to come. Development had been ongoing for a few years, but in 2003, Black Isle was beginning to seriously struggle under the weight of Interplay's management, due in part to Titus's oversight. In the years previous, the team had been forced to cancel projects like Torn and develop a sequel to Icewind Dale in an unprecedented 10 months. 2003, however, would prove to be the worst yet, and unfortunately, the studio's last. At the time, Interplay was caught up in a multitude of legal battles for unpaid royalties, disputes with distributors, and its crumbling relationship with departing CEO Brian Fargo. One legal battle in particular resulted in Interplay losing the license to Dungeons & Dragons, but a loophole still allowed them to continue to develop titles under the Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale names. As a result, the publisher would lose $20 million in 2003. And on top of the nearly $50 million lost in 2001, layoffs and cutbacks began to follow. Black Isle, largely being funded by the revenue generated from the D&D license, was beginning to feel like the next to go, and many of the team working on Van Buren knew it. Studio head Feargus Urquhart would be the first to leave in early 2003, seeing the trouble with the D&D license as a sign that Black Isle was a lower priority for Interplay and wasn't getting the support it needed. Almost immediately after, Interplay would also lose access to the Baldur's Gate title altogether after another legal dispute with developer Snowblind Studios, who worked on the spin-off Dark Alliance. forcing Black Isle to cancel their third entry in the series, The Black Hound. This loss would directly result in Chris Avellone's departure. As the canceled project stacked up, his love for Van Buren was outweighed by the likelihood that it would go the same way. Avellone and Urquhart, alongside former Baldur's Gate 3 developers Darren Monahan, Chris Parker, and Chris Jones, would move to found their own company, Obsidian Entertainment, in June of 2003, moving from the Black Isle to a small piece of Black Rock. Josh Sawyer and a handful of others would stay at Black Isle and continue work on Van Buren. While what remained of the team was proud of the work they had done, it became clear that Interplay had little interest in the project. When they pulled the last senior character artist off of Van Buren to work on something outside of Black Isle, Sawyer knew it was time to leave.
It was really disheartening. It basically made me think they have either no interest or no care for what we're doing.
1 month after he left in December, Interplay would shut down Black Isle, laying off the majority of its employees and officially pulling the plug on Van Buren. By designer John Daly's own estimate, the project had an engine that was 95% completed, with 75% of dialogue and 50% of maps done as well. The employees that remained at Interplay were transferred to their console division to finish up work on the Fallout spin-off Brotherhood of Steel and its planned sequel, the former of which releasing 1 month after Van Buren's cancellation, and the latter being cancelled only a few months later in June of 2004, when the majority of Interplay's employees would be laid off for good. Brotherhood of Steel would be the last game developed internally at Interplay, and the last Fallout title for nearly 5 years. The Fallout franchise, however, wasn't sitting dormant for that entire time. While Interplay was falling apart, they put a large majority of their assets up for auction, including a license to the Fallout IP, and 2 developers were very interested, one just down the road from Interplay in California, and the other across the country in Rockville, Maryland. In Irvine, California, original Fallout creators Tim Cain and Leonard Boyarsky at Troika Games would be hard at work on their own idea for a Fallout-style RPG, maintaining the isometric look, but changing the combat to real-time with pause, similar to Van Buren. To have an opportunity to return to the world of Fallout would feel like regaining custody of their long-lost child. In Maryland, during the late stages of development for their 4th Elder Scrolls game, Bethesda Softworks was looking to ramp up production for another project to fill the potentially long gap between Oblivion and Elder Scrolls V. In a way that mimics Tim Cain and company's experience with Wasteland when developing Fallout 1, Bethesda would begin pre-production on a Fallout-inspired title named Apocalypse Road. To work on the actual thing would have been a dream come true for Bethesda, giving them an opportunity to create something new with a franchise they loved. Forum legend paints a picture of Troika Games on the verge of acquiring the rights and Todd Howard himself bursting through the door at the auction with a comically oversized bag of money. As far as I can tell from both accounts from the time and interviews with Cain and Boyarsky after the fact, this isn't completely accurate. Troika did want the rights but was already struggling under the weight of financial hardships, and as a result, in July of 2004, Bethesda would announce they had begun development on Fallout 3. 3 years later, they would buy the rights to Fallout outright, licensing the IP back to Interplay for an MMO title that had to be released by 2009. When that didn't happen, Bethesda gained complete control over the Fallout IP. It would take until October 2008 for them to release their own version of Fallout, providing a soft reboot of the series and moving its location from the American Southwest to the heart of its government in Washington, D.C. It was a massive departure from previous entries for better or for worse, bringing a mainline Fallout RPG to home consoles and into first person, while adapting its turn-based combat into something described by game director Todd Howard as part Knights of the Old Republic, part Burnout's Crash mode. For a lot of people, this is their Fallout, the one that got them started on the franchise, and for me personally, on RPGs as a whole. And while it certainly doesn't maintain the complicated role-playing of previous titles, removing features such as faction systems or choices with long-lasting consequences altogether, it's very likely Bethesda's second best game behind whatever Elder Scrolls title you played first. It's not Van Buren by any means, and to many, it's barely Fallout. Still, its combination of interesting world building and rewarding gameplay helped turn the franchise into a household name and a staple in Bethesda's catalog. And while the world wouldn't see what Black Isle had in mind for their third iteration, 2008's Fallout 3 paved the way for the closest we ever really got. In 2007, Obsidian Entertainment was in a bit of an odd place. Starting out with the stellar but unfinished Knights of the Old Republic 2, a sequel to BioWare's Star Wars RPG released less than a year and a half later, Obsidian had become a unique part of the rapidly expanding console RPG space that also happened to have as many canceled games as released ones. When they got approached by Bethesda to work on a Star Trek title, however, they politely declined, citing the sorry state the franchise was in. Not long after, however, Bethesda returned with a different proposition, asking Obsidian to get the opportunity Troika never did, and return to the Fallout franchise with Fallout New Vegas. It's important to note that Obsidian's Fallout was never going to be Van Buren. Obsidian is not Black Isle. Despite the similar leadership, they are two different companies with different goals. They'd grown as developers, and things like Van Buren intentionally staying away from Vegas to avoid comparison to Fallout 2's New Reno was no longer relevant or necessary. And despite their strong connection, only 6 of the original 43 Van Buren developers would end up on New Vegas. Most prominently, that included Josh Sawyer as lead designer, and Chris Avellone as a writer of the main game and project director of DLCs. On a similar note, despite taking place 4 years after Bethesda's Fallout 3 and existing in the same aesthetic world, New Vegas was by no means a direct sequel. As Sawyer put it, their goal from the beginning was a sort of Fallout Vice City, and as a result, Obsidian saw very little oversight from Bethesda. Very rarely were any of their ideas outright rejected. Most notably, they weren't allowed to place the game between Fallout 1 and 2, and one location they chose was something Bethesda saw themselves using in the future. Beyond that, they were largely given free rein. The studio was, however, given an incredibly short development timeline of around 18 months, starting in February 2009 and releasing in mid-October 2010. This was just 2 months more than their famously unfinished title KOTOR 2 was given. Going into the project off the back of Van Buren in particular and the recently canceled Alien Crucible, Josh Sawyer was hesitant to be working on Fallout again, seeming to be half expecting the rug to be pulled out from underneath him once more.
When I start working on a game at this point, I'm kind of like, I'm not confident it's going to ship until the manual is printed. Until we get close to the finish, I don't think I'm going to have the same level of excitement that I had back in the early 2000s. It's basically been 11 years coming to this, so I don't want to get ahead of myself until it's actually out the door.
In October 2010, however, Fallout New Vegas actually did find its way out the door, released to positive reviews that mostly criticized its bugginess and praised its wider gameplay depth compared to 2008's Fallout 3. In more recent times, it's ascended to being one of the greatest RPGs of its generation, creating a fascinating world of complicated decisions, characters, and quest lines while still feeling easily accessible. In a lot of ways, it feels almost like it's bridging the gap between the isometric games and what Bethesda had created, keeping in mind what made both eras great. Within New Vegas, however, there's a large portion of ideas from Van Buren that exists. On a less tangible level, it meets many of the goals Van Buren had. Different types of character builds are better accommodated, oftentimes giving them unique dialogue options or unique solutions to a problem. As a direct result of this, decisions, quest lines, and locations feel much more robust, creating choices with lasting impacts. No better was this illustrated than in New Vegas's approach to companions, who were directly influenced by Van Buren's goals of having a wide range of them, all with their unique opinions on the world around them and with their own quest lines, both of which that can be influenced by the choices the player makes. But on a more tangible level, New Vegas borrows a wide range of characters and ideas from Van Buren as well. Most notable is the location of Hoover Dam, which, similar to Van Buren, is in the midst of a power struggle between a variety of factions. But this time around, it's the main focal point where the majority of your decisions' consequences take place in some way. It's understandable, even with the rapid lowering of Lake Mead's water levels, the Hoover Dam is a symbol of power in that part of the world, a reminder of the power of humanity on the forces of nature and how that force can determine where civilizations rise and fall. The city of Las Vegas exists because of it, and with electric power so hard to come by after the bombs fell, control of it would influence the direction humanity would go as it attempts to rebuild. Despite this overlap, only one other location from Van Buren ended up in New Vegas, the Big Empty, a combination of the Big Empty, which was a piece of Van Buren's starting area, and the Boulder Dome, where a team of researchers lived and worked in the ruins of Boulder, Colorado. One of the largest overlaps between the two games, however, was the factions, with the introduction of Caesar's Legion in particular. Despite being a mysterious, relatively minor part of Black Isle's game, New Vegas has them as the main antagonistic force to the NCR, occupying a similar place the Brotherhood did in the fight for the Hoover Dam. It's worth pointing out that a handful of design documents mention that they would be a much larger part of a future Fallout, more than likely in rough outlines the team had for a Fallout 4. While I'm not necessarily speculating that New Vegas is that fourth game, it's interesting to see Obsidian skip that first step while still managing to make Caesar's Legion into a compelling, complicated faction that's as intimidating as it is mysterious. As a result, this connection is felt the most in their disgraced co-founder Joshua Graham, a companion character from Van Buren, and a prominent figure in the New Vegas DLC Honest Hearts. While the name has been changed from the Hanged Man, a reference to the tarot card of the same name, to the Burned Man as the means of his attempted crucifixion has changed, much of his backstory remained the same. He's still a Mormon missionary who encountered a member of the Followers of Apocalypse and helped found Caesar's Legion. In Van Buren, however, he's much more sinister, designed to be a powerful character in combat, but one whose reputation makes conversations and faction relations significantly harder. For a long time, this was the only way Van Buren's ideas saw the light of day. However, in late 2014, RPG Codex uncovered a trademark by former Interplay CEO Brian Fargo's company In Exile, registered for the name Van Buren. In mid-2015, Eurogamer caught up with Fargo, who stated that he didn't have anything set in stone just yet, but had spoken to Chris Avellone about a project similar to what Black Isle's Van Buren had been. Their goal was to make something similar to what they enjoyed making at Interplay. Fargo figured it was best to have the trademark to Van Buren just in case. Avellone had previously worked with In Exile on Wasteland 2, a sequel to the 1988 game that inspired Fallout, and the possibility of a sort of Wasteland Van Buren started to feel very real. In 2017, Avellone would confirm on Twitter that some of the higher-level ideas of Van Buren were going to make it into Wasteland 3. While his impact on the title itself is a little unclear, listing him as additional writer in the game's credits and work to be announced on LinkedIn, the inclusion of a setting in Colorado and the return of original Fallout composer Mark Morgan make it clear that the Wasteland series is intended, at least on some level, as a spiritual successor to Black Isle's work. That being said, a project from In Exile titled Van Buren was never released, and the trademark would lapse in March of 2022. Over the years, 4 major fan projects have arisen to recreate Van Buren. In New Vegas, there's Revelation Blues, shown off in 2021 by United West Development Team, a fan mod that incorporates gameplay elements and story from Black Isle's Fallout 3 while still being actively worked on at the time of writing. The project has no release date or demo, but with the trailer shown off in 2021 and an active Discord providing feedback and suggestions, progress seems to be ongoing. It's a great thing to see, and with Fallout's already impressive modding community, it's a potentially great way for fans already interested in New Vegas mods to play a version of Van Buren. Similarly, there's Beyond Boulder Dome, a finished DLC-sized mod featuring a small portion of the Boulder, Colorado zone and a complete story which, despite the similar location, is very different from the story of Van Buren. Instead, it focuses on a disease called Seltsam syndrome, which turns people into monsters, and the hunt for its cure. It's not trying to be Van Buren, but it is a good way available right now that lets players see one interpretation of what the Boulder, Colorado region was going to be. While still focusing on mods, however, one stands out above the rest. Starting in 2013, Fallout Yesterday began life as a full recreation of Van Buren in Interplay's open-source Fallout Online engine. In recent years, work has instead moved to a Fallout 2 mod with the same goals, maintaining the isometric viewpoint and turn-based combat. It feels a tad poetic, developing Black Isle's cancelled game in the same engine they'd worked on in the past. It's also probably as close a fan mod will likely ever get to accurately recreating what Van Buren is. Work on the mod is still ongoing. However, in 2020, creator PJ estimated that the work was around 50% done, and updates are posted on Patreon almost weekly. The work looks impressive, as much a nice throwback to Fallout's roots as it is a wonderful tribute to a cancelled game. The largest and purest interpretation of Black Isle's Fallout 3 is Project Van Buren, started in 2017 by developer Adam Lacko. Dedicated to recreating Van Buren to, quote, the pettiest detail, Project Van Buren is an impressive Unity Engine standalone title that's as committed to creating a playable game as it is preserving and uncovering Black Isle's work, digging through game files from developers, and enhancing design files. It's a project that's so impressive that it's made my personal asset hunt a bit more challenging, as Lacko's work is oftentimes indistinguishable at worst or far superior at best than the assets publicly available for the original Fallout 3. Despite Lacko's entry into the industry developing New Blood's gorgeous CRPG, He's continued work on Project Van Buren and posts frequent updates on his website and Twitter. It feels like the best chance there is to see a playable version of Van Buren. Van Buren's story is anything but simple. It runs in parallel with the ending of one of the largest companies in the industry, and one of its most influential developers. Its legacy twists outwards, being the impetus for one of the greatest RPGs ever made in New Vegas, and proving Bethesda was more than just Elder Scrolls. But most importantly, Van Buren's story is one about people. The people playing tabletop games in the back rooms of Interplay. The ones stuck in the middle of massive companies crumbling under the weight of their own ambition. The ones that come together to start anew. And the ones fascinated enough by a canceled game to spend years recreating it. When looking at Van Buren through that lens, it's hard to not think of this quote from former Interplay CEO Brian Fargo.
At the time, I would have fired everyone in the company except for Black Isle Studios and kept 40 people, and everything would still go on. I would rebuild Interplay from there.
In a lot of ways, that's exactly what studios like inXile and Obsidian have done. It's rare to see groups of developers stick together like this, but also continue to successfully develop titles that were once considered obsolete. Nowadays, even Tim Cain and Leonard Boyarsky have ended up at Obsidian, developing their spiritual successor to Fallout 1 in New Vegas with The Outer Worlds. Maybe all of this came out of that feeling of unfinished business when Black Isle crumbled. Or maybe everyone really was that good. But whatever it is, it's clear that Van Buren was a project many of its developers were proud of, despite everything. Which isn't half bad for a game that started out with rolling dice in a back room somewhere in California.